My mother-in-law said she was teaching me how to be a woman. She said it was a lesson in character, in service, in what it meant to be part of a family. She wasn't teaching me. She was breaking me. It took me 8 years to understand that. 8 years of holidays spent in her kitchen. 8 years of nodding and smiling while my hands were raw from work. And the worst part is I let her. I thought it was the price of admission. I'm Emily. I'm 40 years old now. I met my husband Daniel when I was 32. He was kind and calm, and he made me feel safe. He was everything I thought I wanted. When he was away from his family, he was a different person. I need to be clear about that. The man I fell in love with wasn't the man who stood by and watched what happened. I was raised to be accommodating, to be respectful. My own mother taught me that you don't make waves, especially with your elders. You show respect, you do your part, and you earn your place. So when I first started going to Daniel's family gatherings, I tried to do just that. I tried to be helpful. I thought that's what a good future daughter-in-law did. The first time, it was a Sunday dinner. The moment I walked into their house, his mother, Margaret, handed me an apron. She didn't ask, she just held it out for me. She told me this was how I would learn my way around her kitchen. It was important, she said. I thought it was a bit strange, but I wanted to make a good impression. I wanted her to like me, so I put it on. I spent the next hour helping her, or rather, doing what she told me to do. I chopped vegetables, I set the table, I filled water glasses, I looked over at Daniel. He was in the living room with his father and his brother watching TV. He just smiled at me, a quick little nod, like this was completely normal, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That first dinner set the tone for everything that came after. It was never a request. It was an expectation. My presence at a family event was automatically a signal that the help had arrived. Every holiday, every birthday, every single Sunday gathering for 8 years. It was the same. I would walk in, and Margaret would have a list of tasks for me. She never wrote it down. It was all in her head, a constant stream of orders disguised as guidance. While the rest of the family sat and talked, I was the one clearing the plates. I was the one washing the dishes by hand because she insisted it was better for her china. She didn't trust the dishwasher. I was the one refilling everyone's drinks. I was the one cutting the cake, serving the dessert, and then cleaning up the mess afterwards. At first, I told myself it was fine. I was contributing. I was part of the family machinery. But I started to notice things. I noticed that Daniel's sister, Sarah, never had to do any of it. She would arrive, sit down, and be served just like the men. His aunts, his female cousins. They all just relaxed. The work was only for me. Margaret had an explanation for that too. She said the other women already knew their roles. They had already learned. It was my turn. It was my training. She would say it loud enough for others to hear. It wasn't a secret. It was a philosophy. This is how women learn. This is how you build character. Discomfort is necessary for growth. I would be in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot, and I could hear them all laughing in the other room. The sound would travel down the hall, and it felt like it was from another world, a world I wasn't invited into. I didn't feel like I was learning. I felt like I was staff. I tried to talk to Daniel about it. Not in an accusatory way. I was too careful for that. I would wait until we were in the car on the way home. I'd say I was tired. I'd say I felt like I missed the whole party because I was in the kitchen the whole time. He would just tell me that's how his mom is. He'd say she meant well. He'd tell me she was just trying to welcome me into the family in her own way. He told me not to take it so personally. It was her house, her rules. The best thing to do was just go along with it to keep the peace. Keeping the peace. That became Daniel's main job in our marriage, and my job was to do whatever it took so that he could do his. So I kept going along with it. I smiled when Margaret handed me a dirty dish. I nodded when she corrected the way I was folding the napkins. I kept my head down and just did the work. I thought that if I did it perfectly, if I worked hard enough, one day she would finally see me. She would acknowledge my effort. She would say, "Okay, Emily, you've learned. You can sit with us now." That day never came. The expectations just grew. It escalated from Sunday dinners to entire holiday weekends. When we would visit for Thanksgiving or Christmas, I was expected to be on from the moment I woke up until the moment I went to bed. I would be the one making breakfast for everyone. While they slept in, I was in the kitchen, making coffee, setting out plates. Margaret would come in later, inspect my work, and tell me what I'd done wrong. The coffee was too weak. The toast wasn't arranged properly. She never raised her voice. That was the thing about her. It was all done with this calm, authoritative tone. A tone that said this was not a discussion, this was a correction. Any hesitation on my part was met with a look of deep disappointment. She would sigh, a heavy theatrical sound, and inform me that a willing spirit was the most important lesson of all. Laziness, she called it, or a lack of gratitude. I remember one Christmas Eve. The whole family was there. There must have been 15 people in the house. I had been cooking and cleaning all day. My back ached. My feet were throbbing. Dinner was finally over. I had just finished loading the last of the dishes into the sink to be hand-washed. I thought, finally, I can go sit down. I can be part of the conversation. I walked into the living room. Everyone was settled, talking, laughing. There were no empty seats, not one. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Daniel saw me. He was on the couch between his aunt and his uncle. He gave me that same little smile. He didn't move. He didn't offer me a spot. He didn't suggest someone else make room. He just looked at me as if I were a ghost in the doorway. And then Margaret's voice cut through the noise. She was sitting in her armchair, the queen on her throne. She pointed to the floor next to her chair. She told me I could sit there, on the floor, like a child or a pet. She said it was good to be near the fire. She framed it as a kindness. I looked around the room. Nobody said anything. Nobody thought it was weird. Sarah was on a comfortable-looking chair. Daniel's cousins were on the other sofa. Everyone had a place, except me. I felt a hot flush of shame. It was so public, so deliberate. But I did it. I sank to the floor and sat on the carpet. I leaned my back against the wall and pretended to be interested in the conversation. I felt like I was a mile away from everyone. I told myself it was just for a night. I told myself it was better than making a scene. I told myself Daniel was just trying to keep the peace. But I knew even then that something was deeply wrong. My husband saw me being offered the floor and he did nothing. He said nothing. His silence was the loudest thing in the room. The tasks kept getting more demanding. It wasn't just about cooking and cleaning anymore. It was about personal service. Margaret would ask me to fetch her glasses from upstairs. She would ask me to find her book. She would have me help her with her coat, even though she was perfectly capable. These were things a person asked of a personal assistant, not a daughter-in-law. Daniel's passivity got worse too. He started to pre-manage me. Before we would even arrive at his parents' house, he would give me a little pep talk. He'd tell me to just be patient with his mom. He'd remind me that the holidays were stressful for her and that the best thing I could do was help out and not cause any trouble. He was framing my exhaustion as me causing trouble. My desire to be treated like a family member was an inconvenience to his peace. I started to feel invisible. My efforts were never praised. They were just absorbed into the fabric of the event. If I did everything, the day was a success. If I missed one small thing, it was because I wasn't trying hard enough. There was no winning. The goalpost was always moving. Compliance was mistaken for consent. My patience was mistaken for weakness. I remember one year, for Margaret's birthday, I spent days planning a special meal. I bought all the ingredients. I cooked for hours. I made her favorite cake from scratch. I served everyone. I cleared the table. I washed the dishes. At the end of the night, as people were leaving, Daniel's aunt came up to me in the kitchen. She put a hand on my arm. She told me I was a saint for putting up with Margaret. She said it in a whisper. She said that Margaret had been like this forever and that everyone just learned to work around her. She said I was doing a great job. And then she left. I stood there in the kitchen, alone again, and I felt this wave of cold clarity. She knew. They all knew. They saw what was happening. They saw the imbalance. They saw me being treated like a servant. They didn't intervene. They just whispered their sympathies in the kitchen when no one was looking. They acknowledged the injustice in private, but they upheld the system in public. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was an endorsement. It was permission for Margaret to continue. And Daniel's silence was the worst of all. His job wasn't to keep the peace. His job was to protect his wife, and he was failing miserably. I realized my husband was not my partner in this. He was his mother's accomplice. He was more afraid of her disapproval than he was of my pain. That was a very lonely realization. The turning point wasn't one big dramatic event. It was a small thing. It was a Thursday afternoon. Margaret had called me. She didn't want to chat. She wanted me to come over and help her. She was hosting a book club meeting that weekend and needed the house to be perfect. She wanted me to come over and polish her silver, all of it, the forks, the spoons, the knives, the serving platters. It was a huge set for 12 people. It would take hours. I was working. I had a job, a career. It wasn't as important as Daniel's in their eyes, but it was mine. I had a deadline that week. I told her I was busy with work. I said I couldn't make it on Thursday, but maybe I could help on Saturday morning. There was a long pause on the phone. Then she told me that a woman's first priority is her family. She said that my work was a hobby, but family was a duty. She said she was disappointed in my attitude. She wasn't angry. She was just sad. It was a calculated sadness designed to make me feel guilty. She told me that she had done the same for her mother-in-law. She said this was how the torch was passed. This was how family traditions were kept alive, through service, through sacrifice. She said, this is how we learn to put others first. And that's when it clicked. All the pieces fell into place. This was not about teaching me. This was not about character. This was not about tradition. This was about control. It was about her being in charge. It was about me being subordinate. It was about establishing and maintaining a hierarchy where she was at the top and I was at the bottom. Her lessons were just a socially acceptable excuse for domination. She was using the language of tradition to justify what was, in reality, just plain bullying. And my husband, my quiet, peace-loving husband, was her enforcer. His refusal to stand up for me was the only reason her system worked. I understood in that moment that my compliance had not been earning me respect. It had been earning me more work. My efforts were not building a bridge to her affection. They were just digging me deeper into a hole of servitude. I would never graduate. There was no finish line. The training would never end, because the point of the training was the training itself. The point was to keep me in a perpetual state of trying to please her. The approval I was working so hard for would never come. It couldn't come, because if it came, she would lose her power over me. I felt this strange calm wash over me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was just clarity. The fog I had been living in for 8 years finally lifted. I realized I had a choice. I had always had a choice. I just hadn't been brave enough to see it. I told her very calmly that I would not be coming over to polish the silver. Not on Thursday, not on Saturday, not ever. I didn't give a reason. I didn't make an excuse about work. I just said no. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I had broken the script. I had refused my role. She hung up without another word. I knew things were about to change. I didn't know how, but I knew the old way of doing things was over. I had just resigned from my position as the family servant. The fallout was immediate. Daniel came home from work that evening, and he was agitated. He told me his mother had called him. She was very upset. He asked me why I had been so rude to her. He said I had hurt her feelings. I looked at him. I really looked at him. And I didn't see the man I married. I saw a stranger who was asking me to apologize for protecting myself. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just told him, I am done. He didn't understand. He asked, done with what? I told him I was done with the lessons. I was done being the only one who worked. I was done being treated like hired help. He started to give me the usual speech, that his mom is from a different generation, that she means well, that I was overreacting. I held up my hand. I told him I wasn't going to debate it with him. I was simply informing him of a change. The arrangement was over. He was stunned. He was so used to me being accommodating, so used to me eventually giving in for the sake of peace. My refusal to engage was something he didn't know how to handle. The next family event was Easter. A few weeks later, it was the big one. The whole extended family would be there. In the days leading up to it, Daniel was a wreck. He kept asking me what my plan was. He wanted to know what I was going to do, what I was going to say. He was trying to manage the situation, to prevent a conflict. I told him I didn't have a plan. I was just going to show up. As a guest, when we arrived at his parents' house, the tension was palpable. The moment we walked in, I could feel every eye on me. Margaret was standing by the entrance to the kitchen. She didn't smile. She just looked at me, waiting. I walked right past her. I went into the living room and sat down on the sofa. It was the most terrifying and liberating thing I had ever done. I sat there, and I could feel her staring at my back. The silence was heavy. Daniel was hovering in the doorway, looking back and forth between me and his mother, like a spectator at a tennis match. After a minute, Margaret walked over to the sofa. She stood in front of me. She told me the potatoes needed to be peeled. She said it as a statement of fact, not a request. I looked up at her. I smiled, a small, polite smile. And I said nothing. I just continued to sit there. She waited. The entire room was quiet. Everyone was watching us. She finally realized I wasn't going to move. Her face tightened. She turned around and walked back into the kitchen. A few moments later, we all heard the loud, angry sound of a cabinet slamming shut. The spell was broken. For the rest of the day, I did nothing. I sat, I talked to the people who were willing to talk to me. I acted like a guest in the house because that's what I was. The meal was late. Things were chaotic. Margaret was flustered, trying to do everything herself, making pointed, loud comments about how some people don't appreciate what it takes to host a family dinner. She tried to delegate to other people. She asked Sarah to help, and Sarah looked confused, as if she'd never been asked to do a chore in her life. She fumbled around in the kitchen for a few minutes and then disappeared. Daniel was miserable. He kept looking at me, his eyes pleading with me to just get up and help, to make it all go back to normal. I didn't. I watched him get up and start clearing plates. I watched him go into the kitchen and start helping his mother. He had to choose. He could either sit with me in this new reality, or he could go back to his old job of enabling her. He chose her. The car ride home was silent. He was furious. I was calm. He eventually exploded. He told me I had embarrassed him. He said I had ruined Easter. He said I was being selfish and vindictive. I let him finish. When he was done, I told him that what he called ruining Easter, I called it tending Easter. I told him that for 8 years I hadn't been attending family events. I had been catering them. And I was no longer in the catering business. I told him I was not responsible for his mother's feelings. I was not responsible for the potatoes getting peeled. I was not responsible for keeping a peace that only existed for him and his family at my expense. I told him he had a choice to make. He could have a wife, or he could have a servant for his mother. He couldn't have both. That was the beginning of the real shift. My refusal to play the part forced everyone else to confront their own roles in the drama. Margaret's power was based entirely on my compliance. When I withdrew that, her authority crumbled. She tried to shame me, but it didn't work anymore. I was immune to it because I was no longer seeking her approval. The family dynamics went into chaos. The gatherings became awkward and tense. Margaret tried to recruit others to her side, complaining about how disrespectful and lazy I was. Some of them agreed with her. Others, like Daniel's aunt, who had spoken to me in the kitchen, were quietly supportive. They wouldn't say it to Margaret's face, but they would give me a little nod or a kind word when she wasn't looking. But the biggest change was in Daniel. He was caught in the middle, and he hated it. His whole life had been structured around avoiding his mother's displeasure. My rebellion had thrown his entire world into disarray. We had a lot of hard conversations. He tried to get me to compromise. He would suggest that maybe I could just help a little bit. Just to smooth things over, I refused. I told him that there was no little bit. The system was all or nothing. The moment I peeled one potato, I was back in the role she had created for me. I told him this wasn't about me versus his mother. This was about what he was willing to accept for his wife. I asked him if he wouldn't be okay with his sister's husband being treated the way I had been. I asked him if he would stand by silently if a guest in his own home was told to sit on the floor. He had no answer for that. He was forced to see the dynamic for what it was, not what he had been pretending it was. He had to confront the fact that his idea of peace was actually just my silent suffering. It was a long and painful process for him. He had to unlearn a lifetime of conditioning. He had to start building a backbone where there hadn't been one before. Slowly, very slowly, things started to change. He started speaking up. The next time we went to his parents' house, Margaret started to make a comment about me just sitting there. Before she could finish, Daniel stepped in. He told her very calmly that Emily was his guest and that they were both there to relax and enjoy the visit. The shock on Margaret's face was incredible. She was not used to being challenged, especially by him. It didn't solve everything overnight. She tried other tactics. She would try to guilt him. She would try to give me the silent treatment. But I had Daniel on my side now. We were a team. My refusal to participate had forced him to finally choose a side, and he had chosen me. He had chosen our marriage. The family gatherings are different now. They are smaller. Some family members stopped coming because they found the new dynamic uncomfortable. They preferred the old way, where the peace was kept and the work was done by the invisible girl in the kitchen. Margaret and I are not close. We never will be. There's a wall of polite distance between us. She doesn't ask me to do things anymore. She treats me like a guest she doesn't particularly like, but a guest nonetheless. I don't need her to like me anymore. I have redefined my place in that family on my own terms. My place is next to my husband. My place is on a chair, not on the floor. I learned that respect is not something you earn through humiliation. It's something you are owed as a human being. And if someone is not willing to give it to you, you have to be willing to walk away, or at least to sit down and refuse to work for it. Daniel learned that passivity is not a neutral stance. It is a choice. His silence hadn't been keeping the peace. It had been enabling the abuse. It took me a long time to see it. I wasted years trying to be the good daughter-in-law, the accommodating wife. I thought my effort was a virtue. But being treated like a servant is not a lesson. It's a warning. It's a warning that your value is being determined by your usefulness. It's a warning that the person teaching you is more interested in power than in your well-being. And it's a warning that the people who stand by and watch it happen are just as much a part of the problem as the person giving the orders. I don't regret saying no. I only regret that it took me 8 years to do it. It began at our first dinner party as a married couple, the one we hosted. I thought it was a work party. I spent 2 days planning a menu, wanting to impress not just Margaret and my father-in-law, but Daniel too. I wanted him to be proud of the home we were building, of the life we were starting. I remember the smell of roasting chicken and rosemary filling our small apartment. I felt like a wife, a hostess, a partner. Then Margaret arrived. She walked in, gave me a cursory peck on the cheek, and went straight to the kitchen. She lifted the lid on the potatoes I was boiling. "A little too much water, dear," she said, her voice gentle, as if sharing a secret. "It leaches the nutrients." She didn't wait for a response. She simply took over, moving around the kitchen with an unnerving familiarity, a quiet authority that turned me from the hostess into her assistant. "Emily, the salad needs tossing," she'd call out while she tasted my gravy. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "Daniel's father can't have too much salt." She'd say it with a smile, the kind of smile that makes you feel like you've been tested and found wanting. It was a lesson, you see. I was being taught. Daniel saw it. He came into the kitchen, a confused look on his face. "Mom, what are you doing? Em's got this." Margaret turned to him, her expression one of serene patience. "Of course she does. I'm just helping her find her rhythm. Every woman needs to learn the rhythm of her own kitchen and then the rhythm of her husband's family. It's a beautiful tradition." She wasn't helping me, she was erasing me. But Daniel, my sweet Daniel, who so desperately wanted to keep the peace, just nodded. He saw his mother helping, and he saw me, his new wife, getting a free lesson. He didn't see me shrinking. He didn't see the hostess becoming a ghost in her own home. He kissed my forehead, whispered, "Just let her help, babe. It makes her happy," and walked back out to the living room. And so I did. I tossed the salad. I set the table with the plates she pointed to. When dinner was served, she accepted the compliments as if she were the head chef and I, the line cook. I sat there, picking at the chicken I had so carefully prepared, and listened to them all talk about a trip they had taken years ago. I had nothing to add. I was just a girl who had overboiled the potatoes. The car ride home was always the worst part, not from our house, but from hers. After that first dinner, the stage was set. All future family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners were at her house. It was her domain, her throne room, and the rules were absolute. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave. My duty was to help Margaret in the kitchen. It was never a question, just a silent, unbreakable expectation. I would spend hours on my feet chopping vegetables, washing dishes, refilling drinks. I would be in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot, and I could hear them all laughing in the other room, and the sound would travel down the hall, and it felt like it was from another world. A world I had a ticket to but was never allowed to enter. Daniel's sister, Chloe, would wander in, grab a glass of wine, and lean against the counter. Wow, you're a lifesaver, Emily. Mom would be lost without you. Then she would wander back out to the laughter. She didn't mean it to be cruel. None of them did. In their eyes, I was performing a noble service. I was learning. I was earning my place. They saw a woman fulfilling her role, a beautiful tradition unfolding. I saw a cage. On the drive home, my feet aching and the smell of dish soap clinging to my skin, I would try to talk to Daniel. It was a nice visit. I'd start testing the waters. Yeah, it was great, he'd say, his eyes on the road. Dad really loved the pie. The pie I made. The pie Margaret had me serve. Daniel, I'd say, my voice softer. Did you notice I spent the entire 6 hours in the kitchen? And then it would come. The gentle deflection, the quiet invalidation. Oh, honey, you're such a huge help to her. She's not as young as she used to be. You make it so much easier for her. But I didn't get to talk to anyone. I'd press, my voice getting tight. I didn't even get to sit down until dinner was over. I feel less like a daughter-in-law and more like the hired help. He would sigh. A long, weary sound that told me I was creating a problem. That's just how she is, Em. It's how she shows affection. She's teaching you things. She sees you as the daughter she never had. The daughter she never had was in the living room laughing. I was the one on my knees scrubbing a spill from the linoleum. He wasn't being malicious. I have to believe that. He was simply a man who had been raised by a queen and was conditioned to see her rule as righteous. His primary function in the family machinery was to keep the gears turning smoothly. My feelings were grit in the system. His solution was not to fix the machine, but to grind my feelings down until they were fine enough to pass through without causing a jam. To him, my silence was the sound of peace. The worst time was the third Christmas. The family had grown. Chloe had gotten married, and her husband's parents were there, along with a few cousins. The house was bursting with people, with the scent of pine and cinnamon, with loud overlapping joy. I had been on kitchen duty for 5 hours straight. I'd prepped the appetizers, helped Margaret with the turkey, mashed 10 pounds of potatoes, washed every dish as it was used, and served champagne on a tray. Finally, it was time to open gifts. Everyone migrated to the living room, finding their seats on the plush sofas or the comfortable armchairs Margaret had arranged in a welcoming circle around the tree. I finished wiping down the last counter, took off the apron that felt like a uniform, and walked into the living room. There was nowhere to sit. Every single chair was taken. Daniel was squeezed onto the love seat next to his dad. Chloe and her husband were on the main sofa. The guests filled the rest of the seats. I stood there in the doorway, a ghost in a red sweater, feeling my smile freeze on my face. Daniel saw me. He gave me a small, helpless shrug, as if to say, "What can you do?" Then Margaret's voice, clear and calm as a bell, cut through the chatter. "Emily, dear, just find a spot on the floor by the hearth. You don't mind, do you? It's cozy there." The room went quiet for a second. Every eye turned to me. I was standing, they were sitting. I was the odd one out, the piece that didn't fit. I looked at Daniel, a desperate, silent plea in my eyes. "Say something. Tell your cousin to make room. Offer me your spot. Do something." He looked away. He picked at a loose thread on his sweater. He did nothing. Passivity is not a neutral stance. It is a choice. And so, I chose to obey. I walked over to the fireplace, my legs stiff, and I lowered myself to the floor. I sat on the scratchy wool rug, my back against the hard brick of the hearth. From down there, the Christmas tree looked enormous, a towering giant. The adults on the chairs looked like giants too. I pulled my knees to my chest and watched them from below, like a child or a pet. They started passing presents, their hands moving over my head. The sound of their laughter was louder from down there and more distant than ever. I sat on the floor for 2 hours. I told myself it was about making space for the guests. I told myself it was about being accommodating. I told myself that a good wife, a good daughter-in-law didn't make a scene. She kept the peace. She understood her duty. She learned her lessons. But as I sat there, feeling the rough weave of the rug through my pants and looking at the heels of my husband's shoes, another thought took root. A cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear thought. She wasn't teaching me, she was breaking me. The silence in the car on the way home from that Easter was a new species of quiet. For 8 years, our drives home from his parents' house had been filled with a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that presses down on your chest. It was the silence of my resentment and his refusal to acknowledge it. It was loud. This was different. This was a thin, crystalline silence, so fragile I felt the vibration of the engine might shatter it. Daniel's hands were clamped to the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his knuckles white. He stared straight ahead at the road, but I knew he wasn't seeing it. He was replaying the scene. The sight of his wife on the sofa and his mother's face, a mask of cold fury. We were 10 miles from our house before he spoke. His voice was rough, scraped raw. I don't know how we fix this, Em. I kept my eyes on the passing houses, the dusk settling over manicured lawns. The old me, the accommodating me, would have rushed to soothe him. It's okay. We'll figure it out. I'll call her tomorrow. The words were a phantom limb, an instinct I had to consciously suppress. I took a slow breath, letting the urge pass. We already started, I said, my voice even. This is fixing it. He glanced at me then, a quick, jerky movement. There was panic in his eyes, the look of a man who had just kicked over a hornet's nest and was only now realizing he was surrounded. She wouldn't even look at you, he said. My whole family. They just stared. Yes, I said. They're not used to seeing me sit down. It was probably a shock. He didn't have a response for that. The rest of the drive passed in the same brittle quiet. When we got home, he walked straight to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a whiskey, downing it in 2 swallows before pouring another. He stood with his back to me, leaning against the counter. I watched the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself as if waiting for a blow. He was a son caught in the crossfire of a war he had spent his entire life trying to pretend didn't exist. The fallout wasn't explosive, it was a slow creeping frost. Margaret, true to form, did not engage in a shouting match. Her methods were always quieter, more insidious. She began what I came to think of as the Great Freeze. She stopped calling me entirely. My birthday passed in May with a deafening silence. No card, no text. It was a deliberate, calculated erasure. Instead, she called Daniel. Every day. I would be in the kitchen making dinner and I'd hear his phone buzz, see him retreat to the bedroom to take the call. The conversations were short. His end was mostly monosyllabic. Yeah, Mom. I'm fine. No, nothing new. Okay, you too. Bye. He would emerge from the room, looking older, a little more stooped each time. He never told me what she said, but I knew. I didn't have to hear the words. I knew the tone of a mother's disappointment, the carefully crafted guilt, the questions designed to sound innocent but land like accusations. Is Emily happy now? Is she feeling better? It must be so nice for her to finally be able to rest. She was trying to pry us apart with the crowbar of his loyalty. She was making him pay the price for my rebellion. Passivity is not a neutral stance. It is a choice. For 8 years, Daniel had chosen the path of least resistance, which meant choosing his mother's comfort over my dignity. Now the path of least resistance had forked. There was no easy way out. He was being forced to choose over and over with every phone call. The first major test came in June. Daniel's brother, Mark, was turning 40. There would be a party at Margaret's house. Of course, it was the only stage she knew. Maybe we just send a gift, Daniel said one night, staring at the invitation on the counter as if it were a court summons. Just this once, let things cool down a little more. I looked at him, at the hope in his eyes that I would let him off the hook, that I would be the accommodating one again, just for a little while, to keep the peace. And I felt a pang of pity for him. I truly did. He was a man unlearning a lifetime of conditioning. It was a painful, clumsy process. But my pity could not be allowed to become my cage again. No, I said softly. He flinched. No, we can't do that, Daniel. Because if we skip this, we're telling her she won. We're telling her that her behavior has the power to keep us from celebrating your brother's birthday. We're letting her control us from a distance. He sank into a kitchen chair and put his head in his hands. So what do? Walk in there and pretend like nothing happened? No, I said, sitting down across from him. I reached out and put my hand on his. We go, but we go on our terms. We'll stay for 1 hour. We'll be polite. We will wish Mark a happy birthday. We will sit down together. On the furniture, we will not do any work. And after 1 hour, we will get in our car and leave. Together. I was laying out the rules of engagement, not just for his family, but for him. For us, I was showing him what a boundary looked like. It wasn't a wall to keep people out. It was a door with a lock that we controlled. He was quiet for a long time, tracing the wood grain on the table. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at me. The panic was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "Okay," he said, 1 hour. Walking into that house felt like walking into a theater after the play has been abruptly rewritten. The actors were all there, but they no longer knew their lines. My aunts-in-law, who had once watched me scrub their plates, now gave me tight, uncertain smiles and scurried away. My cousins-in-law mumbled hellos and suddenly became fascinated by the pattern on the rug. I was a ghost at the feast, a problem nobody knew how to solve. They had all been complicit in the old system, comfortable in their roles. My refusal to play my part had exposed the entire artifice, and they didn't know how to function without it. Margaret was a master of passive aggression. She greeted Daniel with a hug that was theatrical in its duration, her hand stroking his back. She looked right past me, her eyes sweeping over my shoulder as if I were a coat rack. She had perfected the art of making a person feel invisible. We sat on the love seat. Daniel's leg was pressed against mine, a small, solid point of contact in a sea of tension. He was rigid, but he was there. He hadn't bolted. Margaret moved through the room, a queen holding court in her wounded kingdom. She laughed a little too loudly. She made a show of carrying a tray of appetizers. "Oh, my poor back," she sighed, loud enough for half the room to hear. "It's just not what it used to be. It's so hard doing everything on your own." The words were aimed over her shoulder, but they landed squarely in the space between Daniel and me. It was a brilliant performance. She wasn't the tyrant, she was the victim. I was the selfish, lazy daughter-in-law who had abandoned her duties, leaving this poor aging woman to fend for herself. I could feel the gazes of the other family members slide toward me, full of judgment. I felt Daniel tense beside me, a low growl of frustration in his throat. I saw his jaw clench. This was the moment he could defend me, escalating the conflict, or he could stay silent, letting the poison seep in. He did neither. He reached for a cheese puff from the coffee table. "Everything looks great, Mom," he said, his voice calm and casual. "You shouldn't have gone to so much trouble. We're just happy to be here to celebrate Mark." It was perfect. It was a move of astounding grace. He didn't take the bait. He didn't engage with the subtext. He simply affirmed our position as guests, as family members there to celebrate. He built a small wall around the two of us with his words, deflecting his mother's attack without launching one of his own. Margaret's smile faltered for just a second. Her attack had found no purchase. It had glanced off the new, united front of our marriage. She turned away without another word. We stayed for exactly 1 hour. We gave Mark his gift. We had a slice of store-bought cake. Then I looked at Daniel, and he nodded. "Well, we should get going," he announced to the room. "Great to see everyone." We walked out the front door together. The silence in the car this time was different yet again. It wasn't heavy or fragile. It was light. It was the quiet of shared relief, of a battle survived. About halfway home, Daniel reached over and took my hand. He didn't say anything, just laced his fingers through mine and held on. I looked at our joined hands. For years, I thought the lesson Margaret was teaching was about service and duty. I thought the price of admission into this family was my labor. I was wrong. The real lesson was never for me. It was for him. The lesson was about choice, about where a man's true allegiance lies. His mother had been teaching him that his duty was to her. I had to teach him that his duty was to us, to the family we were building. The lessons hadn't stopped. We were just learning a different one now. He was no longer just keeping the peace. He was keeping his wife. The silence in the car on the way home was a different kind of silence. For 8 years, the car had been a space of contained pressure, the air thick with my unspoken resentment and Daniel's desperate desire to pretend nothing was wrong. The silence then had a sound, the low hum of his denial. But this time, the quiet was soft. It was the gentle stillness that follows a storm, when the air is washed clean and you can finally breathe again. I stared out the passenger window, watching the streetlights blur into long golden ribbons. I felt his gaze on me several times before he finally reached across the console and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, a gesture so simple, so overdue that it felt monumental. It wasn't a gesture of placation, a hurried attempt to smooth things over before we got home. It was an anchor. "I'm sorry, Em," he said, his voice low and raw. He didn't say what for. He didn't need to. In that one moment, he was apologizing for all of it. For the 8 years of holidays, for every dish I washed while he laughed in the other room, for the Christmas I sat on the floor, for his silence, his deafening, crushing silence. I squeezed his hand. He saw me, I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Your uncle, he saw me sitting there, and he saw you standing with me." "My dad saw too," Daniel said, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of my hand. "They all saw. They've always seen, I think. I was just the only one who refused to look." That was the truth of it. His family wasn't blind, they were complicit. They were all cogs in the family machinery that ran on my service and Margaret's command. By refusing to work, I had jammed the gears. By standing with me, Daniel had broken the whole machine. When we got home, the tension didn't return as it usually did. We walked into our quiet house, and for the first time, it felt entirely like ours. Not a temporary reprieve from his mother's world, but our own sovereign space. Daniel made tea while I sank onto our sofa, the one I had picked out, the one that held no memory of humiliation. He sat beside me, handing me a mug. "She'll never forgive me for that," he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of fact, a quiet recognition of the price. "She's not angry you defended your wife, Daniel," I said, my voice even. "She's angry you disobeyed her. You took away her power." He nodded, staring into his mug. All those years I told myself I was keeping the peace. I thought peace was the absence of fighting, the absence of raised voices, but it wasn't peace, it was just quiet. A brittle, hollow quiet that was breaking you, breaking us. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was almost hard to witness. "I was a coward. I used you as a shield so I wouldn't have to stand up to my own mother." I didn't deny it. I didn't soothe him. He needed to own the truth of it, to hold its full weight. Passivity is not a neutral stance. It is a choice. And for 8 years, he had chosen his mother's comfort over his wife's dignity. But tonight, he had made a different choice. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now," I said, taking a sip of tea. "We live our lives, here, together." The fallout was not loud and explosive. It was a slow, creeping frost. The weekly phone calls from Margaret to Daniel dwindled, then stopped. When his sister Claire called, her voice was strained, caught between loyalty to her mother and a flicker of sympathy for me. The invitations to casual Sunday dinners ceased entirely. We were being quietly, methodically excised from the family body. The first real test came 2 months later. Daniel's cousin was having her baby christened. The invitation arrived addressed only to Daniel. Not Daniel and Emily. Just his name, a deliberate, calculated slice of the knife. He held the thick cardstock in his hand, his jaw tight. "She's trying to split us," he said. "If I go alone, it proves her point, that I'll eventually come back, that you are the problem. And if you don't go, it's a declaration of war," he finished. He tossed the invitation onto the counter. "Good. Let her have her war. I'm done fighting for a peace that doesn't exist." He took out his phone and sent a text to his cousin, congratulating her and politely declining, citing a prior commitment. He didn't explain, didn't justify. He just said no. The silence that followed that decision was absolute. We were officially in exile. A week later, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Patricia, Margaret's older sister, Daniel's aunt. She was a quiet woman who I'd only ever seen at the periphery of family events, always observing with sad, knowing eyes. "Emily," she said, her voice thin, like aging paper. "I hope I'm not overstepping." "Not at all, Patricia. It's lovely to hear from you." There was a pause. "I heard you and Daniel won't be at the christening," she said. "Margaret is, telling a story about it, about you." "I'm sure she is," I said, my heart a dull, heavy ache. I wanted to... I don't know. I wanted to tell you something, she said, and her voice dropped lower, conspiratorially. Margaret wasn't always like this. Not exactly. But she learned it. Oh, did she learn it? I sat down, listening. Our mother was a gentle soul, Patricia began, her voice unspooling a story from 50 years ago. But our father's mother, Daniel's great-grandmother, was a tyrant, a true queen on her throne. And when Margaret married Daniel's father, that woman did to Margaret exactly what Margaret has done to you. Exactly, I was there, I saw it. She described a younger Margaret, eager and accommodating, being run ragged, being forced to serve, to clean, to earn her place in a family that had already decided she had none. She told me about a Christmas, long ago, when Margaret's mother-in-law had given away all the good seats and with a cool smile told a pregnant Margaret she could find a spot on the floor. The echo was so perfect, so chilling, it stole my breath. It broke something in her, Patricia said softly. She did it for years. She served. She kept the peace. She did her duty. And when her mother-in-law finally passed, Margaret stepped right into her shoes. It was like she had been waiting. She said she had learned her lesson. She said that's how a woman earns her character, through service. But it wasn't about character, Emily. It was about power. Once she had it, she was never, ever going to let it go. She wasn't teaching you. She was repeating a lesson that had been beaten into her. She was a product of the same fire she had tried to forge me in. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something that resembled pity. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an excuse. But it was a key, unlocking the final dark room of my understanding. Margaret wasn't just a cruel woman. She was a link in a chain, a victim who had chosen to become a perpetrator rather than break the cycle. She had survived her trial by fire and decided her reward was to get to burn someone else. Thank you, Patricia, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Thank you for telling me. Daniel's a good boy, she said before hanging up. He just needed to decide to be a good man. When I told Daniel, he was quiet for a long time. It wasn't his story to know. It was a secret history of the women in his family, passed down through service and suffering. He had only ever seen the end result, his powerful mother and the wife she was trying to break. That night, we didn't talk about Margaret anymore. We didn't talk about the family we had lost. Instead, we pulled out a cookbook and decided what we would make for Easter, just the two of us. We planned a menu. We talked about what wine to buy. We were building our own traditions from the ground up. We were building our own table. It has been 2 years since that phone call. Our life is smaller now and infinitely larger. The grand, tense holiday gatherings are a thing of the past. In their place are quiet dinners with friends, spontaneous weekend trips, and Easter spent in our own home with 2 place settings at the table. Daniel's relationship with his mother is one of distant, careful civility, confined to birthday cards and short, infrequent phone calls. The war ended and everyone lost, but we won the peace. I learned many lessons during my time in Margaret's service. I learned how to polish silver, how to cook for 20 people, how to be invisible, but the real lessons came after. Silence is not peace. It is the absence of truth. Service is not a path to love. It is a transaction. And a woman's character is not built on her knees, scrubbing another's floor. It is built when she stands up. My place was never on the floor. It was never in the kitchen while the party happened somewhere else. My place is here, on my sofa next to my husband, at a table of my own making. The line went dead, but I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the hollow hum of nothing. The silence in my own house was a physical thing, a stark contrast to the storm of information that had just broken over me. I lowered the phone slowly, placing it back in its cradle with a hand that felt disconnected from my body. Patricia's words echoed in the quiet kitchen. She was just like you, Emily, her own mother-in-law. The floor, she told me, it nearly broke her. It was a key, turning a lock in a room I didn't even know existed. And inside that room was not a monster, but a ghost. The ghost of a younger Margaret, humiliated and broken, being taught her place. My first instinctual reaction was a wave of pity so sharp it felt like grief. I saw her, not as the cold matriarch on her living room throne, but as a young woman, probably not much older than I was when I first met Daniel. scrubbing pots and swallowing her own tears. A woman who had been told to sit on the floor. A woman who had been made to feel like a ghost in her own family. I sank into one of my own kitchen chairs, a sturdy, simple wooden chair that matched the others around my table. A chair that was always there. I looked around my own kitchen, at the soft yellow walls and the pot of herbs on the windowsill. This was my space, a place of warmth and nourishment, not a chamber of servitude. The pity I felt for Margaret was real, but it was a shallow thing, a pebble dropped into a very deep, very dark well. Because as I sat there, another feeling began to surface, colder and harder than the pity. It was a chilling, terrible clarity. Margaret had stood at a crossroads, the same one I had faced, a crossroads where the pain inflicted upon you can either be absorbed and transformed, or it can be sharpened into a weapon to be wielded against someone else. She had a choice. One path led away from the abuse, toward a future where no other woman would have to endure what she did. The other path led right back to it, only this time she held the whip. She chose the whip. The realization settled not with a crash, but with a quite devastating weight. All those years, all those lessons she had imparted, they weren't about building character. They weren't about honoring tradition. They were about reenactment. She wasn't teaching me how to be a good wife. She was teaching me how to be her. She was meticulously recreating the conditions of her own humiliation, casting me in the role she had been forced to play. The Christmas I was told to sit on the floor, it wasn't a spontaneous act of cruelty born from a lack of chairs. It was ceremony. It was a script, passed down through a generation. She was passing the torch of her own degradation, and she expected me to carry it. She didn't survive her lesson and vow to end the cruelty. She survived her lesson and waited for her turn to become the teacher. Understanding is not absolution. My pity for the young woman she had been could not excuse the choices the older woman had made. It only made them more tragic, more monstrous. She had taken her pain and instead of healing it, had used it to poison someone else. Me. That evening, when Daniel came home, I didn't rush to tell him. I waited until we had eaten dinner, until we were sitting on the sofa with the soft glow of a lamp between us. The silence was comfortable, the kind we had been building for months now, brick by brick. I spoke to your Aunt Patricia today, I said, my voice even. He turned to me, his expression open and curious. The old Daniel would have tensed, brassing for a complaint, an argument, a relitigation of old wounds. The new Daniel just waited, he listened. I told him everything. I recounted Patricia's words, the story of his grandmother, and the identical scene of humiliation his mother had endured decades ago. I watched his face as I spoke, and I saw the story land on him, not as an excuse, but as a final horrifying piece of the puzzle. His face, which had been relaxed, tightened with a pain that was all his own. It wasn't the pained frustration of a man caught between his wife and his mother. It was the deep personal horror of a son realizing the true nature of his family's legacy. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. He stared at the floor, at the space between his feet, as if he could see the ghosts of both his mother and me sitting there. So she knew, he finally whispered. His voice was raw. All this time, she knew exactly how it felt. Yes, I said softly, and she did it anyway. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. He looked up at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound, shattering sadness I had never seen in him before. My God, Emily, every single Sunday, every holiday, she had a choice. She could have been the one to stop it. She could have protected you. Instead, he trailed off, shaking his head slowly. She chose to hurt you, the same way she was hurt. In that moment, I saw the last vestiges of his old role, the peacekeeper, the defender of his mother's good intentions, crumble into dust. He finally saw it all for what it was, a legacy of pain, wrapped in the pretty paper of tradition and passed down like the family silver. He saw that his entire life, what he had called peace, had actually been a carefully managed system of abuse, and his role had been to silence the victim. She tried to make you her, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm, desperate. And I let her. I held the door open for her. We both did. I corrected him gently. I was the one who kept walking through it. But he shook his head. It was my job to stand in the doorway. It was always my job. That night, something shifted for good. The mystery of Margaret's cruelty was solved, and in its place was a sad, pathetic truth. She was a victim who had chosen to become a perpetrator. A prisoner who, once freed, had decided to become the jailer. It was a story as old as time. The calls from his family eventually slowed to a trickle, then stopped. We were no longer invited to the Sunday dinners or the holiday gatherings. The silence from their end was meant to be a punishment, a final assertion of their power. We were being excommunicated from the family machinery, but it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like liberation. Our weekends became our own. We would go for long walks. We'd cook together in our yellow kitchen, the air filled not with the heavy silence of duty, but with the easy murmur of partnership. We discovered the simple joy of a Sunday with no agenda, no performance, no impending sense of dread. We were building something new. One Saturday, months later, we were planting a small garden in our backyard. The sun was warm on our backs, and our hands were dark with rich soil. It was quiet, peaceful work. Daniel paused, leaning on his trowel, and watched me firm the earth around a young tomato plant. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I think I finally understand what a family tradition is supposed to be." I looked at him, wiping a smudge of dirt from my cheek. "What's that?" "It's not something you force on people," he said, looking from my face to the small, hopeful plant in the ground. "It's something you grow together." I smiled, a real bone-deep smile. He was right. Traditions aren't meant to be cages. They are meant to be anchors. And the lessons a family passes down shouldn't be about submission and survival. They should be about grace. The poison had stopped with Margaret's generation. She had chosen to drink it and then serve it to me. But I had refused the cup. And Daniel, my husband, my partner, had finally stood beside me and helped me push it away. We had been offered a poisoned inheritance, and we had turned it down. The chain was broken. It ended with us. Our legacy would be a garden, not a ghost. The click of the receiver settling into its cradle was the only sound in the room, a tiny, definitive noise that ended one story and began another. The silence that followed was immense, heavy with the weight of a history I had never known. Daniel stood by the window, his back to me, looking out at the darkening street. I sat on our sofa, in our home, a piece of furniture we had chosen together, and felt the cushions give beneath me. A simple comfort, a right I had fought for. Patricia's words echoed in the quiet. She went through the same thing, Emily, the exact same thing. Her mother-in-law made her sit on the floor too, when she was pregnant with Daniel's older brother. The revelation didn't land like a bomb. It was quieter than that. It was like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed, opening a door into a dark, dusty room. And in that room was Margaret. Not the queen on her throne, the calm, tyrannical matriarch I knew, but a younger woman, frightened and humiliated, with a baby, swelling her belly and her back aching from the hardness of the floor. For a moment, a flicker of something raw and painful moved through me. It was almost pity. Almost. But it was quickly replaced by something colder, clearer. A terrible, crystalline understanding. She knew, all these years, she knew exactly how it felt. Every time she sent me to the kitchen, while the laughter echoed from the other room, she wasn't just creating a servant. She was recreating a ghost. My ghost, her ghost. Every sharp, dismissive wave of her hand, every time she called my name, with that tone of entitled expectation, she knew the precise sting of the wound she was inflicting. She had the memory of the salt and the sting inside her own soul. The lesson wasn't for me to learn how to be a wife. The lesson was for her to prove she had survived. The price of her survival was my subjugation. She had climbed out of the pit by pulling me down into it. "Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but firm in the still air. He didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders tense. "I can't," he whispered, his voice thick. "I can't picture it." "Picture what?" "My grandmother," he said, finally turning. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that was entirely new. This wasn't the familiar pained look of a man trying to keep the peace. This was the look of a man realizing the peace was never real. My father's mother, she was just this little old lady who gave us candy. I can't picture her doing that to my mom. People aren't just one thing. I said, the words coming out with a weariness that felt ancient. He walked over and sank down onto the armchair opposite me, his body folding in on itself. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers pressing into his eyes as if he could physically push the images away. All those years, he murmured. All those Christmases, those Easters, I just thought, that's how she was. That was her personality. Stern, traditional. It was a tradition, I agreed. A tradition of cruelty. The silence settled again, but this time it was different. It was a shared space where we were both looking at the same ugly truth. Before, the silence in the car on the way home from his parents' house had been a wall between us. My pain on one side, his denial on the other. Now there was no wall. There was just the rubble of his family's legacy, and we were sitting in it together. Why didn't she ever say anything? He asked, his voice raw. Why would she do it to you? Why wouldn't she protect you from it, from what she went through? And there it was, the question that separated a victim from a perpetrator. It was the question I had been asking myself in the moments after Patricia's call. Because that would have meant admitting it was wrong when it happened to her, I said, piecing it together. And if it was wrong, what did that make her whole life? What did that make her silence, her duty, her decades of keeping the peace? It would have meant that her suffering was for nothing. It's easier to believe your suffering was a lesson, a forging of character. It's easier to pass the lesson on than to admit you were just broken for no reason at all. She wasn't teaching me. She was validating herself. My service was the proof that her service had meant something. It was a chain, and she was just the next link, passing the poison down the line. To her, breaking the chain would have been a betrayal of her own sacrifice. Daniel looked at me, and I saw the full weight of his complicity land on him. Not just his complicity in my pain, but in the entire rotten system. He had been a guardian of the tradition, too. His passivity was the lock on the kitchen door. His desperate need for quiet was the soundproofing that kept the laughter in the living room from being contaminated by the sound of my lonely work. God, Emily, he said, his voice cracking. When she told you to sit on the floor, I just froze. I felt like a little boy. I saw my dad, my uncles, none of them saying a word. And I did the same thing. I did nothing. I know, I said softly. He reached across the space between us, not to quiet me, but to find my hand. His fingers laced through mine, a silent, solid anchor. It was the contact I had longed for in the car all those years, the simple acknowledgement, the partnership. She wasn't just teaching you, he said, his voice hollow with realization. She was teaching me too. How to be a husband like my father, how to look away, how to let the women do the work and the suffering. That was my inheritance. It was the most honest thing he had ever said about his family. The confession was liberating. It wasn't an excuse. It was an explanation. It was the final piece of the family machinery laid bare for us both to see. We sat like that for a long time, holding hands in our quiet living room as the streetlights came on outside. There were no recriminations. There was no "I told you so." The fight was over. We had already won it that day at Easter when I sat on the sofa and he brought me a plate of food. This revelation from Patricia was not the battle. It was the autopsy. It was the final clinical understanding of the sickness that had nearly killed us. I thought of Margaret, old now in that house that was her stage in her prison. I wondered if she ever sat alone in the living room and saw the ghost of her younger self on the floor. I wondered if she saw me there too. Did she see us as two separate women? Or did our images blur into one endless, repeating cycle of silent female duty? Maybe that was the real lesson she was trying to teach. That this is what it means to be a woman in her family. You serve, you suffer, you stay silent, and eventually, you earn the right to make someone else serve and suffer and stay silent. It was a ladder of pain, and she was just waiting for me to start my climb. But I had refused to put my foot on the first rung. I chose to get off the ladder entirely. I chose to build a home on solid ground. "What do we do now?" Daniel asked, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of my hand. "Nothing," I said. The answer was simple. It was finished. "We do nothing. We live our life here together." He nodded, a slow, deep affirmation. He finally understood. The silence wasn't about avoiding a fight anymore. It was about protecting our peace. Our quiet excommunication from his family wasn't a punishment, it was a release. I am 40 years old now. I have been married for 12 years. For 8 of those years, I was a student in a class I never signed up for. But I learned something in the end. I learned that some traditions are not meant to be honored. They are meant to be broken. I learned that true strength isn't enduring pain quietly. It's refusing to accept it in the first place. Margaret's lesson was meant to be about duty and character. But the lesson I took away was my own. A legacy is not something you inherit. It is something you choose to accept. And I was choosing a different one. We were choosing a different one. A legacy of chairs for everyone. A legacy of kindness. A legacy that started right here in this quiet room with this hard-won peace. It was a legacy of our own making. I placed the phone back in its cradle, the click of the plastic sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of our kitchen. Daniel had been standing in the doorway watching me, his face a mask of concern. He had only heard my side of the conversation, the quiet questions, the long listening silences. He hadn't heard Aunt Patricia's voice, thin and reedy with age and regret, as she unburdened herself of a 40-year-old secret. "What was that?" he asked, his voice gentle. I leaned back against the counter, the cool laminate a stark contrast to the heat rising in my face. The story Patricia had told me was replaying itself in my mind, casting every memory of the last 8 years in a sickening new light. Margaret, young and pregnant, being told to sit on the floor. Margaret serving her own mother-in-law, her hands raw from scrubbing pots while the family laughed in the other room. Margaret learning her lesson. "That was your Aunt Patricia," I said, my voice flat. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just my husband, but the son of a woman I suddenly, horribly understood. "She told me about your grandmother, your father's mother." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Grandma Rose? She died before I was born. What about her?" I took a breath. "She did to your mother exactly what your mother did to me." The silence that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't the tense, angry silence of our car rides home. It wasn't the weaponized silence Margaret deployed in her living room. This was a heavy, hollow silence, the kind that rushes in to fill a vacuum. Daniel's face seemed to collapse inward. The confusion gave way to a dawning, horrified comprehension. "Everything," I said, the word feeling small and inadequate. "The serving, the cleaning, the exclusion. Patricia said Grandma Rose was a tyrant and she broke your mother. She told me about a holiday when your mom was pregnant with you. There wasn't a chair for her." I didn't need to finish the sentence. I saw the end of it land on him like a physical blow. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the same one he'd sat in just a few weeks ago, asking me to polish the silver. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly. She made her sit on the floor while she was pregnant?" I just nodded, my throat tight. He stared at the polished wood of our kitchen table, but I knew he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing his own mother, young and vulnerable. He was seeing a history he never knew existed, a secret that had poisoned his entire family structure. The queen on her throne was once the girl on the floor. The woman who demanded service was once the servant. "All this time," he whispered, his voice cracking, "all this time I thought it was about character, tradition, that it was some noble thing she was trying to teach, a lesson." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw, bottomless grief. It was a grief for me, for the years I had lost. But it was also a new grief, a complicated and painful grief for the mother he thought he knew. He was mourning the woman she might have been if she had chosen a different path. "She wasn't teaching," I said softly, the truth of it finally clear and solid in my own mind. "She was reenacting. She wasn't building character. She was passing on the pain. The anger I had carried for so long, that righteous, burning indignation, didn't vanish, but it changed. It cooled, settling from a raging fire into something dense and heavy like stone. It was no longer just my personal injury. It was a generational wound, a legacy of cruelty passed from one woman to the next, disguised as duty. Margaret hadn't invented the system. She had simply become its most faithful administrator. She had learned the lesson so well that her only impulse was to teach it again, to find another woman to place on the floor so she would never have to sit there again herself. Passivity is not a neutral stance. It is a choice. My husband had made that choice for 8 years out of fear. But now he understood what he had been afraid of. Not a strong, unbending matriarch, but a deeply wounded woman terrified of her own history. He had been trying to keep the peace in a house that was never peaceful, only quiet. In the weeks that followed, the quiet excommunication we had been experiencing became official. There were no more passive-aggressive texts from his sister Sarah, no more stiff one-line emails from his father. The phone simply stopped ringing. The void they left was palpable at first. Holidays approached on the calendar Mother's Day, then his father's birthday, and the silence felt like an accusation. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter. It was Sarah. He looked at me. Before answering, a silent question in his eyes, I gave him a small nod. He had to walk this path himself. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to read a magazine, but I heard his side of the conversation clearly. His voice was calm, measured, and firm in a way I had never heard him use with his family. Hi, Sarah. No, we don't have plans. I know it's Dad's birthday. No. There was a pause. I could imagine Sarah on the other end, her voice rising with incredulity, with the familiar cadence of guilt. Can't you just apologize? Mom is so hurt. You're tearing the family apart. The old script. No, Sarah. We won't be coming. Daniel said, and the finality in his tone made me look up. This isn't about one argument. It's about a pattern that has gone on for years, and it's over. Emily is my wife. She is my family. We are not going to participate in it anymore. I understand you feel that way, but my decision is made. I love you too. Goodbye. He ended the call and stood there for a moment, his back to me. When he turned around, his face was pale, but his eyes were clear. He had done it. He had chosen. He had drawn a line not in the sand, but in solid rock. He had finally protected me, and in doing so, he had protected us. That evening, we didn't talk about the phone call. We didn't need to. Instead, he came into the kitchen while I was making a simple pasta dinner, something we would have never dared to eat on a Sunday when we were on duty at his mother's. He didn't just stand in the doorway. He came over to the cutting board, picked up another knife, and started chopping garlic. We worked in comfortable silence, the rhythmic tap of our knives on the board a quiet kind of music. It was a partnership. It was easy. There was no performance, no audience, no one to please but ourselves. We ate at our small table, with 2 chairs, 2 plates, 2 equal people. The rage was gone. The resentment had dissolved. In its place was a profound, aching sadness for Margaret. She had been given a choice, the same choice I had been given. When faced with the cruelty of tradition, she could have been the one to say, "This ends with me." She could have looked at the daughter-in-law who entered her family and vowed to give her the respect and kindness she herself had been denied. She could have broken the chain. She didn't. She chose to forge it stronger and wrap it around me. That day never came for her, but it came for me. The real lesson wasn't about how to serve, or how to earn a place, or how to be a woman in her family's twisted mold. The real lesson was that you can't heal a wound by inflicting it on someone else. The real lesson was that my place was not on the floor. It was in my own home, at my own table, sitting in a chair I had chosen for myself. We were no longer part of Margaret's story. The silence from her house was no longer a punishment. It was a quiet space we were filling with our own lives, our own laughter, our own traditions. We were finally writing our own chapter, and in our story, everyone had a seat. The phone call from Aunt Patricia ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than any conversation. Daniel stood by the window, his back to me, looking out at the darkening street. I sat on the edge of our bed, the phone still resting in my lap, feeling cold despite the warmth of the room. The story Patricia had told of another grandmother, another kitchen, another woman made to feel like a ghost in her own family, didn't land like a bombshell. It was quieter than that. It was like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed, opening a door into a room that was dark, dusty, and full of a sorrow that wasn't mine but felt horribly familiar. Margaret had been a victim. The same floor she had pointed to for me had once been her place. The same laughter from the other room had once been the soundtrack to her own isolation. The lesson she had been so determined to teach me was simply the only lesson she had ever been taught. For a moment, a strange, watery pity rose in my throat. I saw her not as the queen on her throne, but as a young woman, just like me, desperate for acceptance, paying a brutal price of admission. I saw the long, lonely years it must have taken to harden that girl into the woman who could so calmly inflict the same pain on another. She hadn't just inherited her mother-in-law's silver, she had inherited her cruelty. It was a family heirloom, passed down from one generation of women to the next. But the pity was fleeting. It was a pale, thin emotion, and it withered in the heat of my own memories. The memory of my hands raw from scrubbing her pots, the memory of my back aching as I served plate after plate, the memory of the profound, soul-crushing humiliation of being told to sit on the floor like a child or a pet. Understanding the origin of a poison does not make it any less deadly. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice thick. He finally turned from the window, and his face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. There was grief for the mother he thought he knew, and a deeper, more profound guilt that now had a shape and a history. "I'm so sorry, Emily, I never knew." "I know," I said, and it was the truth. He crossed the room and sank onto the bed beside me, not touching me, just sitting in our shared space of shock. "All those years," he whispered, mostly to himself, "she was just doing what was done to her." I reached out and placed my hand on his. His skin was cold. "Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but firm, forcing him to meet my eyes. It was a reason. It was not an excuse. He flinched as if the words were a physical slap. But he nodded, a slow, painful acknowledgement. "No," he said, "it's not an excuse, it's a tragedy." That was the word. Not malice, not evil. Just a long, repeating tragedy. And Margaret, in her desperate attempt to survive it, had chosen to become its perpetrator rather than its final victim. She had had a choice. At some point in some kitchen decades ago, she had faced a crossroads. Break the cycle or continue it. She chose to continue it. She chose to believe that this was how women were forged, that this suffering was a necessary tradition, that her pain had earned her the right to inflict it on someone else. I had made a different choice. The weeks that followed that revelation were quiet. The knowledge settled over our marriage, not as a wedge, but as a strange, somber foundation for what we were trying to build. Daniel's transformation, which had begun with my ultimatum, now deepened. His passivity had been born of a desire to keep a peace he thought existed. Now he understood he had only been policing the terms of a ceasefire in a war that had started before he was even born. The enemy wasn't his wife's sensitivity. It was the tradition itself. His phone calls with his mother became shorter, more perfunctory. He no longer tried to fill the silences she deployed like weapons. He would state his boundary, "No, Mom, we're not available that weekend," and then simply wait for her to respond. He was learning that her disappointment was not his responsibility to manage. It was a slow, painful process for him. I would see him hang up the phone and close his eyes, the dutiful son in him warring with the husband he was trying to become. But he never wavered. He chose me. He chose us. Then came Thanksgiving. In all our years together, Thanksgiving had been Margaret's magnum opus. It was the ultimate performance of her role as matriarch and my role as chief servant. The weeks of planning, the 2 full days of cooking, the endless parade of dishes, the orchestrated chaos where I was the only one working and everyone else was family. In mid-November, the call came. I was reading in the living room when Daniel answered his cell. I could tell by the way he straightened his spine who it was. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carefully neutral. I held my breath. I could hear the faint, tinny murmur of her voice through the receiver. I knew the script. She'd be talking about the turkey, the number of guests, asking when I would be coming over to start the prep. "Actually, Mom," Daniel said, and my heart hammered against my ribs. "We're not going to make it for Thanksgiving this year. Emily and I are going to have a quiet one at home." A long pause. I could feel her silence from across town. It was a heavy, judgmental thing. I pictured her in her immaculate kitchen, clutching the phone, her face tightening with that familiar look of profound, personal injury. "No, everything's fine," Daniel continued, his voice steady. "We just decided we want to start our own tradition. Just the 2 of us." Another pause, more murmuring. I could guess the words. "But it's tradition. But I need the help. But what will I tell everyone?" The guilt was being ladled out, thick and hot. I understand you're disappointed, Daniel said, and this was the new part, the part I had never heard before. He wasn't apologizing, he wasn't scrambling to fix it. He was just acknowledging her feeling. But this is what we're doing. I'll call you later in the week. Love you. Bye. He ended the call and let out a breath so deep it seemed to come from the soles of his feet. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of terror and triumph. I got up, walked over to him, and wrapped my arms around his waist. He buried his face in my hair, and we just stood there for a long time. It felt more significant than any holiday we had ever spent with his family. It was the sound of a cage door swinging shut with us on the outside. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke up not to an alarm, but to the sun. There was no giant frozen turkey waiting for me. No list of chores. The house was still and peaceful. Daniel made coffee, and we sat at our small kitchen table, the one that had only 2 chairs. It feels weird, he said, staring into his mug. I know, I said, it feels like we were playing hooky. We didn't cook a feast. We didn't spend the day laboring. We took a long walk in the crisp autumn air, our hands intertwined. We came home and watched an old movie. For dinner, we roasted a small chicken, just big enough for 2. We made mashed potatoes and a simple salad. I didn't serve him and then eat later. We sat down at our dining room table together. We lit candles. We opened a bottle of wine. It was the most revolutionary meal of my life. I looked across the table at my husband. The faint lines of strain that had been etched around his eyes for years seemed to have softened. We talked. Not about his mother, not about the past, but about the movie we watched, about a book I was reading, about his plans for a project at work. It was simple. It was normal. It was everything I had ever wanted. There was no distant laughter from another room. The only sound was our own voices, the clink of our forks against our plates, the quiet music playing from a small speaker in the corner. There was no duty. There was no service. There was only partnership. Later, as we washed the few dishes together, side by side at the sink, I thought of Margaret. I pictured her in her house, the Thanksgiving machine grinding on without me. Maybe she'd gotten one of my sisters-in-law to fill the role. Maybe she'd done it herself, her body aching with the labor, her heart aching with the bitterness of abandonment. I felt a pang, not of pity, but of a deep, profound sadness for the cycle she could not break. She was taught that a woman's place was in service to a tradition that exhausted her. She believed the only way to gain power was to wield that tradition against the next woman in line. I looked at Daniel, rinsing a plate and handing it to me to dry. We were building something new. It wasn't a grand dynasty built on obligation and silent suffering. It was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more precious. It was a sanctuary. My place is not on the floor. My place is not in the kitchen while the family laughs elsewhere. My place is here at the table, sitting in a chair that belongs to me, across from the man who finally learned that keeping the peace is not worth the price of his wife's soul. Tradition is not an inheritance you are forced to accept. It is a choice you make every single day. And that day, we had chosen peace. Not the brittle, false peace of compliance, but the real, sturdy peace of freedom. The phone call with Aunt Patricia ended, but her words hung in the quiet air of our living room for a long time. Daniel sat beside me on the sofa, his hand resting on my knee, a silent, solid weight. For years, Margaret's cruelty had been a shapeless, monstrous thing. It had no logic, no source. It simply was. Now it had a story, a history. She had been the one scrubbing pots in the kitchen. She had been the one serving a family that saw her as part of the household machinery. She had been the one told where to sit, what to do, how to be. She had learned her lessons from a master. So that's it, Daniel said, his voice low and raw. All this time, she was just doing what was done to her. I nodded, staring at the wall, at the framed photo of us on our wedding day. We looked so young, so unaware of the slow, grinding war that awaited us. It's an explanation, I said carefully. It's not an excuse. He turned to look at me, his brow furrowed. What's the difference? An excuse absolves you of responsibility, I said, the words coming out with a clarity that surprised even me. An explanation just gives the pain a name. It tells you where the poison came from. It doesn't make it any less poisonous. She wasn't teaching me. She was reenacting her own trauma. The kitchen wasn't just a room for service, it was the stage for a play she had been forced to learn. And now she was the director, casting me in the role she had once been forced to occupy. The humiliation wasn't a byproduct of her expectations. It was the entire point. She had been made to feel small, so I had to be made to feel small. It was a terrible, vicious passing of a torch. It was a reason, not a right. That knowledge didn't erase the 8 years of hurt, but it shifted something fundamental inside me. The anger, which had been a hot, sharp thing, cooled into a profound and weary sadness. I saw her not as a queen on a throne, but as a prisoner who had been handed the keys to the jail and instead of walking out, chose to become the warden. She had a choice. Every single holiday, every single visit, she had a choice to break the cycle. She chose not to. That day, the last vestiges of my need for her approval crumbled into dust. You cannot seek warmth from a person who is fundamentally cold, who has mistaken the chill of their own suffering for the temperature of the world. Our first holiday in the new silence was Thanksgiving. In previous years, the weeks leading up to it were a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The mental preparation, the bracing for impact, the strategic planning of what to wear, what to bring, how to be just accommodating enough to avoid the worst of her quiet disappointment. This year, there was nothing, no calls, no summons. The day came, and the silence from Daniel's family was a palpable presence in our home. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy one, filled with unspoken accusations and the weight of their judgment. "It feels weird," Daniel said, standing in the middle of our own kitchen as I pulled a small turkey from the oven. The whole house smelled of sage and roasting potatoes. It was our smell, not hers. "It's not weird," I replied, setting the roasting pan on the counter. "It's just quiet." We didn't make a feast. We made dinner. We worked together, moving around each other in the easy, familiar dance of a couple who knows their own space. Daniel mashed the potatoes while I made the gravy. He opened a bottle of wine, the one I liked, and poured us both a glass. There was no performance. There was no audience. We ate at our small dining table, the one that only seats 4. There was music playing softly, a jazz station Daniel had found. We talked about a movie we'd seen, about a project at his work, about a funny thing our neighbor's dog had done. We talked about nothing, and it meant everything. I looked across the table at my husband. His shoulders, which for years had been hunched with the tension of trying to serve 2 masters, were relaxed. He met my gaze and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "This is nice," he said simply. "Yes," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "It is." It was just peace. A peace born not of surrender, but of a quiet, firm rebellion. We were no longer catering them. We were nurturing us. My place was on a chair, at my own table, beside my husband. It was a lesson, I thought with a flicker of bitter irony, that I had finally learned. The real test, however, came 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday evening. The phone rang, and the caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in months, Margaret. Daniel and I looked at each other. The quiet peace of our evening was instantly shattered, replaced by the old familiar hum of anxiety. He reached for the phone, his jaw tight. He gestured for me to stay, then pressed the speaker button. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice even. "Daniel," she said. Her tone was bright, brittle, as if the last 8 months of radio silence had never happened, as if Easter had been a pleasant dream. "I was just calling to coordinate for Christmas." I held my breath. Coordinate, not invite. The language of logistics, of assumption. The language of a commander who expects her orders to be followed. "We'll be having everyone over on Christmas Eve as usual," she continued, a breezy authority in her voice. "I'll do the ham, of course, but I'll need Emily to handle the side dishes. The potatoes au gratin, the green bean casserole, and that sweet potato thing she does. And Daniel, I'll need you to pick up your grandmother from the station at 2. It was all there. The complete erasure of my autonomy. The relegation to the role of cook. The casual assumption of our compliance. It was a masterclass in her particular brand of tyranny. I watched Daniel's face. I saw the flicker of the old fear, the instinct to just agree, to keep the peace. I saw him wrestling with the ghost of the man he used to be. Then he took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and resolute. "Actually, Mom, that's not going to work for us this year," he said. A beat of silence on the other end. What do you mean it's not going to work? It's Christmas Eve. It's what we always do. I know, Daniel said, but Emily and I are starting our own traditions. We're going to be staying home this year. Just the two of us. He said it. He said we. He didn't say Emily's not feeling up to it or we have other plans. He didn't make an excuse. He stated a fact. He presented us as a unit with our own needs and our own new traditions. He was building a boundary brick by brick right there on the phone. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on, growing colder and heavier with each passing second. This was not the response she expected. This was not part of the script. When she finally spoke, the fake brightness was gone. Her voice was flat, sharp, and cold as ice. I see. Another pause. I could almost hear the calculations in her head, the search for a lever of guilt or obligation, but she found none. We had taken them all away. Well, she said, her voice dripping with a carefully curated disappointment that was meant to wound. I hope you're happy. Click. She hung up. Daniel slowly put the phone down on the table. He let out a long, shuddering breath and slumped back against the sofa, closing his eyes. The tension drained out of him, leaving him looking exhausted but free. I looked at him, my husband, the man who had finally learned to stand not between his mother and his wife, but beside his wife, facing the world together. I thought of Margaret, a young woman in a kitchen, her hands raw, her heart hollowed out by duty. I thought of the pain she inherited, a toxic heirloom passed down through generations. Pain is a legacy. It flows from one person to the next, a river of sorrow, unless someone is strong enough to build a dam. Margaret had been given that chance, and she had chosen to let the river flow, directing its current straight at me. But we had built our dam. We had rerouted the river. Here, in our quiet house, the water was calm. Passivity is not a neutral stance, it is a choice. And so is breaking the cycle. I am done, we are done. The lesson is finally over.